All right, so now I'm going to go over all of the parts in the cylinder head. So this is the main part of the cylinder head itself. So it's got this main block, it's the cylinder head, and then inside it is all of these other components. So one thing that will be coming up into the cylinder head are your two push rods, and in our engines, the push rods for each valve are actually different. So the bigger push rod that's made out of aluminum is going to be for the intake because that's going to basically have less heat going towards it because there's not going to be as much heat bringing in cold air for the intake. But the one that's going to be going up against the exhaust is made out of steel. So that's going to have hotter temperatures. So I make that one out of steel. The intake is the cooler one. So these are the two push rods. So they'll be coming up and pushing on the rocker arm, which is this part right here. And I have one of them pulled out. So this part right here is the rocker arm. And then there are two parts that hold the rocker arm in place. So there's the rocker arm, and then sitting inside that is the rocker arm screw and the pivot. So the pivot would actually sit right here in this spot with the rocker arm underneath of it. The pivot would sit there, and then that would be where the rocker arm pivots, which is why it's called pivot. Makes sense, right? So then the screw holds them down together. There is also an adjustment part here on the rocker arm that has a set screw in it so that if you need to adjust the valve clearance, so how much room there is between the rocker arm and the valve, you can adjust this set screw by twisting it in or twisting it out so there's more or less room. So that's what this part is right here. So some other parts on the valve. So your valve would be sticking out of this port right here. I'll put this one back in quick. So your valve would be sticking out here. Your valve spring is this part right here, would be over top of that. And then holding the spring to the valve, you would have these parts right here, which are the parts for the valve keeper. So there's this main disc, and then holding those together are these two little bitty pieces right there that actually hold everything in place. So this is why I haven't had you guys take this much apart. It's because I don't want you to lose these little pieces, because if they fall off, then the valve isn't going to be able to be held in. So just so that you see, those are these pieces. Now to take them out, it's actually really kind of difficult to compress the spring enough to get the keeper pieces taken out. So we use these tools here. These are just two different types of the same tool. They are valve spring compressors. So I will show you here how those work. Okay, so I'm going to use the valve spring compressor here that's kind of built like a C-clamp. So what you'll do is put this bottom part against the bottom side of the valve and this top part on top of the keeper, and then compress them together. So you'll set them in place and then start twisting it like a C-clamp. And then the valve spring will start to get lowered down. Then I will set these clips in there around the valve stem. And then I'm going to start bringing the spring back up.
Make sure you weren't in the middle of the video.
I am. It's all right, I can cut it out. I'll probably have to redo it anyway because I keep screwing it up.
I had two right out in the greenhouse with one
Oh, really?
transplanted. Anyway, she was when I was out there trying to start.
Hey, I actually got it that time. All right, and if okay, so I'll show how to use the valve spring compressor. So with the valve in the valve guide, take the spring, put it on top, take the cap part of the retainer, put that on, and then put the compressor on top of the keeper and start to twist them together to clamp that spring down. Okay, then once this arm hits the cylinder head, that is as far as you can go, and then it's time to put these two little pieces in. When you put these two pieces in, you want to keep them evenly spaced around the valve stem. So we'll try to do that while it's compressed. Get them both placed on here. I'm not pushing them down yet, I'm just kind of setting them in place. And then I'll start to slowly let the valve spring come back up, and those should kind of fall into place. And now your valve spring is reattached. Okay, now putting the rocker arm back on is really pretty simple. So what we'll do is set the rocker arm kind of down roughly in its place. Then we will take the rocker arm pivot and we will put that down in its spot above the threaded place for the rocker arm screw. Put the rocker arm screw down in there. Start it a ways, and then I'm going to use this 1/4-inch drive ratchet with an 8mm socket and finish putting that screw down. And the manual, or at least what I have found on Briggs & Stratton's website, does not give a torque recommendation for this particular screw. So I'm just going to tighten it down what I think is a reasonable tightness. I'm not trying to strip any of the threads or anything, so I'm just going to tighten it down to where it's good and snug, and then call it good. So now that rock arm is put in place. Now there's some things that we need to think about before we actually get to put these on the main part of the engine. So before the cylinder head goes on, one of the things we'll need to do is get all of the old gasket that was on here, or at least as much of it as we can, taken off of there so that the new gasket can get put on cleanly. So this is a new gasket, so get all the old stuff taken off on both the cylinder head and on this face of the cylinder itself. So get that all cleaned off so that the new gasket will be able to seal well. The other thing you need to figure out is, does this cylinder head go to this cylinder, or does it even matter? So there's a couple ways to figure out which one it goes to. I'll tell you now, it does matter. So we need to figure out which one it goes to. A way to do that, with just kind of thinking through it, is by figuring out which of these ports goes where. So I know that the carburetor is going to sit in the middle of this engine, so the intake is going to need to face towards the inside. So then we need to figure out which of these ports, is it this one, or is it this one down here that's the intake? So to figure that out, we'll look at the valves. I can see these two valves. One of them is bigger than the other, and this one's also darker colored than the other one. So the bigger one's lighter colored, the smaller one's darker colored. So I know that the intake valve will always be the bigger valve, and your exhaust valve will typically be darker colored because of the heat as well. So with this being the intake valve, the port that is closest to is this one right here. So that would mean that this port needs to face the inside or the middle of the engine. So that would mean that it would either be sitting here like this, or it would be sitting on this engine or on this cylinder like this. So you can make it face the center either way, but that means that if it's on this side, the exhaust port, which would be this one now, would be facing down, and on this side, it would be facing up. So if the exhaust is facing up, that means it's going to be blowing right into your other engine components, which would not work out very well. So it makes a lot more sense for that exhaust to be blowing down away from the rest of the engine. So this is the side it would go on. A much simpler way to tell which side it goes on is by looking at the stamped numbers on the engine. This has right here on the cylinder head an S1, meaning side 1, and there's also a 1 stamped on this side. On this cylinder there is a 2 stamped over here, and on the other cylinder head there is an S2 stamped. So I know that this cylinder head with the S1 on it goes to side 1. All right, now we're going to go ahead and install this first cylinder head. I've already got the gasket set in place, just resting on these guide pins there. Then we'll take the cylinder head and slide it into its place over those guide pins so that it's resting there. And then we'll take these cylinder head bolts and start putting them into their places. So I have them all started now. Now I'm going to use the wrench again. It's just a 1/4 inch drive ratchet again. Got a 3/8 inch socket with an extension on here to help me reach this inside bolt. So I'm just going to get them kind of to the actual surface, and then I will use the torque wrench to get them to the proper torque. And now that those are all down to the surface, I will finish torquing them down with the torque wrench. Again, I've got a 3/8 inch socket with an extension, and I'm going to be torquing these down to about 18 foot-pounds, or 220 inch-pounds is the torque. Oh, also keep in mind that when you torque these, again, like what you did with the crankcase cover, you don't just want to go around in a circle, or it will kind of warp the cylinder head a little bit as you tighten it down. So you want to kind of go in a pattern around so that you're not making that warp. All right, now that those are all torqued down, your cylinder head is in place. We'll do the exact same thing over on this other cylinder, and then they will be on and ready to go. All right, now it's time to go ahead and put in our push rods and set the valve clearances. So the one I'll put in first will be this intake one. It's the aluminum wider diameter push rod. The only reason I'm putting it in first is just because I feel like putting this one in first. There's no real rhyme or reason why you should put one in before the other. So I'll put the intake in first. This one will be the one on top, goes to where the intake will actually come in. So I'll put this in top. Inside the cylinder head here, there is a rod guide. So you need to put the one end of your push rod in the rod guide, and then your other end of the push rod will come in here under the rocker arm. I've already gone ahead and backed out the rocker arm screw a little bit to give some room to get this under. And then once I get the push rod under the rocker arm, I'll tighten that screw back in. Okay, then that's the intake, and I'll do the same thing with the exhaust. So I'll go ahead and back out the rocker arm screw a little bit. As I started doing this exhaust push rod, I noticed that I was really having a hard time getting enough clearance to get the push rod underneath the rocker arm. And what I ended up having to do is actually get the adjustable wrench, crescent wrench, and turn the crankshaft enough so that the tappets would drop back down far enough for me to get the push rod into that guide. So that's what you see me doing right here is I'm turning the crankshaft to get that tappet to move downward so that I can get the push rod further in. And then I made it work. Now that we have the push rods in place, it's going to be time to set the valve clearance. So we want there to be just a little bit of a gap between the rocker arm and the valve stem. That gap in the specification manual says that the gap should be between 4 thousandths and 6 thousandths of an inch. So I'm going to use this 5 thousandths inch blade on the feeler gauge to set the gap. That's right in the middle of where it's supposed to be. So to do that, we need to make sure that the piston is at the top dead center of the compression stroke. Because when it's at top dead center of the compression stroke, neither valve should be getting pushed on by the rocker arm. So that's when there should actually be a gap. If the rocker arm was pushing on one of the valves, obviously there would be no gap. So we want that gap to be set at top dead center of the compression stroke when neither of the valves are getting any pressure on them. So to check to see where the piston is, you obviously can't just look through the engine and see where it is, so we need to have another way. What we'll do is actually turn the crankshaft, and we can watch the valves to see what movement they are making. And I'm also going to use a pencil or just some kind of a small rod stuck through the spark plug port directly to the piston. So when I stick this through right now, I can feel the pencil hitting right away, which tells me that the piston is at pretty close to top dead center right now. But I don't know if that's top dead center of the compression stroke or top dead center of the end of the exhaust stroke. So what I need to do is start turning this and see what the valves do. So I'll start to turn this, and right away, watch this top rocker arm. You can see it start to push the valve down. So if it's pushing that top valve down, that tells me that the intake stroke would be happening right now. That intake valve is opening up, letting the air and fuel come in, and my pencil is going down as the piston moves down. I'm going to keep turning it. Now the intake valve is closed, and I can feel the piston coming back up. So now the compression stroke is starting to happen. And when this pencil comes all the way out and isn't coming out any further, I will know that I'm at top dead center of the compression stroke. So right there. So at this point in the stroke, there should be that 4 to 6 thousandths gap for both valves. So when I check this, I'll use the 5 thousandths inch blade, which is right in the middle, and stick that in between the rocker arm and the valve stem. Now this one here, that blade fits through fairly easily. I will use the 6 thousandths inch blade, see if that one goes through. And that one still goes through pretty easy. I think we've got a gap that's probably bigger than it's supposed to be, so we're going to have to set that gap properly. If I use the 7 thousandths inch gap, this one isn't supposed to go through, and it still goes through easily. So we're definitely going to have to set this one properly. To do that, we're going to have to use the rocker arm adjuster. This adjuster has two parts to it. It's got a set screw, and it's also got a locking nut on it to keep the set screw from moving. So what we're going to have to do is you can back the set screw out without loosening that nut. And then they will back out. And you'll want to loosen that nut a little bit further so that we can actually screw this set screw in further than what it was just now. So now I'm going to start tightening that set screw with the feeler gauge in between the valve and rocker arm. And I'm going to kind of move the feeler gauge back and forth and feel when it starts to get some pressure on it. So right there feels like that's the good snug point for that 5/1000 inch blade. So I'm right in the middle of where that valve clearance should be. So now what I'll do, now that set screw's in the right spot, I'm going to use a 13 millimeter wrench, and I'm going to tighten that nut down without moving the set screw. So I'll put the wrench on, and I'm going to put the driver back in place just to help hold the set screw from moving. So now I'm going to just keep tightening that nut until it gets tightened down. Good and snug. And I'm going to recheck my clearance. One fits good. 6/1000 is pretty tight. 7/1000 won't fit. So our clearance is set properly there. I'm just going to do the same process to this other valve, and everything will be set correctly. Now the last thing to do for the cylinder heads is to put on the valve covers. So it does make a difference. You've got two valve covers. It does make a difference which cover goes on which cylinder. The cylinder or the valve cover for this right cylinder, there's something else I want to point out. It has written on it the engine model, type, and code. A common place to find that information is on the valve covers. So if you're ever looking for that on any other engine, that is a good place to start looking, is on the valve cover. So this particular one will go on this cylinder 1, and the one for cylinder 2 that you really want to make sure you don't get it screwed up has this hole on it where you've got a tube that goes to your fuel pump. So you want to make sure that this cover gets put on cylinder number 2. Otherwise it'll be screwed up. So to put it on, I've already put on a fresh gasket and made sure everything was clean before doing so. And then we will just put the cover on so that the letters are facing the right direction, facing up. We will put it in place and start to put these bolts in. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch socket to help tighten these down. All right, and with that one on, just go ahead and do the same thing on your other valve cover.